Welcome everybody to this month's webinar on SharePoint Embedded, where we are going to cover some content container management best practices. I am Steve Puslik. I'm a senior product manager on the SharePoint Embedded team. Excited to share with you a lot of the new and upcoming events around SharePoint Embedded and some of the functionality within the containers that run SharePoint Embedded. Taking a look at the agenda, this is what we have on tap for today. We'll go through a brief overview of SharePoint Embedded. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, we'll provide a bit of an overview of what SharePoint Embedded is, how some of those features, functionality can work into your application. Then we're going to dive right into containers, the heart of SharePoint Embedded. What are containers? How do we manage them at scale? What are some of the architectures that we can use to within our applications that are going to scale nicely? Talk about permissions and security. How do we secure the content that's in those containers? How do we share content that's out? And then lastly, we're going to talk about the Customer Connection Program, program that we offer here at Microsoft that allows you to get some guidance as you're taking those applications from proof of concept into production. So a lot of good stuff on the agenda here. I do invite you to keep the chat active. We do have a couple folks that are monitoring the chat. Any questions or comments that you do have, feedback, always want to hear that from you. So keep this as interactive as we can. Do want to make an announcement on an upcoming event that we are holding in both New York and London around SharePoint Embedded. This is the ability for you to come and work with us directly. We're going to be there. We're going to walk you through what some of those applications look like. You have a chance to meet with some of your colleagues, some of the other folks that are using SharePoint Embedded, get insights into some of the roadmap items that we're producing, but more importantly, hands-on keyboard. Let's start using SharePoint Embedded, put those into your application so that we can start to scale accordingly. Okay, little overview about SharePoint Embedded before we get into some of the container management portion of it. SharePoint Embedded really is that ability for you to put content at scale in your applications. What we don't want to do, and some of the challenges that we're seeing within the industry today, is if you are creating that custom application, nobody wants to create a content management system. They're complicated. There's a lot of nuances. They have matured over the years, and now doing that at scale within your applications is really, it's a tough ask. We've had a lot of customers that are thinking that, yes, we can use traditional methods to scale accordingly. But then when we look at the more mature products that are on the market, incorporating those features into your application just becomes a bit of a challenge, if you will. And that's where SharePoint Embedded really starts to shine. It is that API only. We call that a headless SharePoint for applications. Again, if you're writing that custom application that needs that content management, SharePoint Embedded is a way to do that. It is dedicated partition in your M365 environment. This is how you can separate the permissions, separate it from your existing SharePoint content that you may have out there. All the full collaboration activities that you would normally expect within the M365 environment, purview, collaboration, security compliance. If you want to use it as an e-discovery source, you can certainly do that. Content management controls, we'll get into what some of those controls are. If you're a governance person that wants to maintain that content and that posture across your tenant, we have the controls in place. Again, it's built on top of that M365 environment. Copilot ready. It's got to be Copilot ready to scale with the different generative AI and expectations that you're seeing with Copilot today. Because it is integrated into that SharePoint search experience, Copilot is a beautiful thing. Everything is powered by the Graph API. We'll get into some of the nuances on configuring the SharePoint embedded application, how you consume that within those Graph endpoints. And again, that business continuity. Within the tenant, we're going to see how it's respected within your tenant, how it's respected within the geo configuration that you have, and the redundancy that you would expect from the M365 environment. All right, so the features that are in your app, these can go on for quite a while. I mean, there's just all the expectations that you need in your application, you're going to get within the SharePoint embedded environment. Content AI, a lot of the processing, image tagging, content assembly, all of those different features that you have that you may be familiar with on the syntax end of things. Content is in your containers. You're going to be able to use those features within those containers. Security and compliance, again, full integration with Purview. If you're the compliance officer and you need to have DLP, you need to make sure those sensitivity labels are spread across the entire org. This is absolutely the way that you're going to be able to accomplish that. Seamless integration, as you would expect. It's another container, another place to hold that content fully supported within that M365 ecosystem. Collaboration, we need to work on documents together. And this is where the co-authoring, all of that experience that you would expect within a full Office integration, right within SharePoint Embedded. From a developer perspective, this is so simple. When you are developing your application, part of the information that we're providing to you is that endpoint on where's the document, incorporate that into a page, click on the link, puts that document into the Office viewer, you get the full Office experience that you would like. Really nothing more than that. Very simple. And then storage. Any file type goes in there, scales to a millions of documents as you would expect. Metadata is supported, files and folders, permissions, the recycle bin, everything that you would expect to have within a content management system, you're going to get within that SharePoint embedded environment. Okay. Things that we're seeing today with a traditional SharePoint storage is you have that rich interface. And this is the delineation that you as developers need to make when you're trying to determine, is SharePoint Embedded going to be a good platform for me, or should I stick with the SharePoint environment that we have today? If you are looking for that rich interface, SharePoint's going to be the ticket. If you are looking for that ability to easily add content into a document library, create those site collections, traditional SharePoint type of activity, SharePoint's going to be the way that you're going to focus. You can obviously use that graph and the REST APIs within your applications if you want to, but this is where we're seeing a lot of customers that want that dedicated storage. They want the full control over their application so that they can determine what that user experience is going to look like. That's where SharePoint Embedded will have the ability to scale accordingly, and you as a developer have the ability to put that interface, user experience, business logic as you need to within your environment without writing that document management system in the background. Again, this is the beauty of it. You plug that in through the Graph API experience, and now you're able to take advantage of that within those applications. Okay. Few use cases that we're seeing. If you can imagine claims processing, you're receiving a lot of claims in from customers. You need to store those somewhere. You need to execute a workflow. There's probably some specific business processes that you have in place before you're going to pay the claim. All of those are going to be supported within your application. But the ability to store several claims, thousands of claims per hour, if you will, transact on those within SharePoint Embedded. Audit documents, again, we're starting to see a lot of external collaboration between the firms themselves and clients. Imagine that you're working with your accountant to put tax documents in for the reporting season. You need a place to put those. Those are some of the things that we can do. Legal, you're interacting with your attorney for closing real estate or a case that you're working on together. Again, that external collaboration fully supported, but then having that internal storage capability so that you can use that as you would suspect from there. So I'm going to take a quick pause here. Reed, are there any questions, comments in the chat that we can start to focus on?
Hey, Steve, we got a shy group this morning, but probably after they hear you stopping and asking for questions, they'll post something. I do want to invite you to talk a little bit more about one aspect that people often are curious about here, and it's the core difference when you talk about security in SharePoint Online versus security in SharePoint Embedded. Can you kind of compare those two real quick?
Yeah, so the security in SharePoint Online is focused on Entra. So naturally, we have our security principal in Entra ID, and the site collection starts to create that boundary of who has access to what. And then within that site collection, you've got your traditional libraries that you can apply security to. Then in the library itself, you've got folders and files, and that can be as granular as you want it to be. So if you wanted to get very specific on, hey, I want this folder to be only accessible by Reed, and then Alan does not get access to it, those are some of the different security parameters you can put on that. SharePoint Embedded, think of that container as that initial boundary of documents that are going to be held, but then in that container is where you have your files and your folders. When you add permissions to that container, it will provide the ability to get access to what's in that container. But unlike a document library in SharePoint, SharePoint Embedded has that additive permissions, meaning that Read is going to be added to the container with view-only capabilities. But now when I get down to a folder, I'm going to grant you full access to that folder. So you can override that or add permissions to that. The concept of having item level permissions, something that we're thinking through and working on, but right now that's going to be one of the big differences that you're going to want to get your head around from a SharePoint perspective into the SharePoint Embedded world.
Okay, that's perfect. And one more question on that. Is there any security or rights inheritance that happens between SharePoint Online and SharePoint Embedded, or are they completely independent?
Completely independent. So this is where you're going to focus on that SharePoint container, that SharePoint embedded container, as being that isolated repository for your documents. So even on a search perspective, they're completely isolated from a search experience, from a traditional, hey, I'm going to go to the SharePoint search bar, do a search on, read secret document that's going to be in SharePoint Embedded, and naturally that's not going to appear in those search results.
Wait, you knew about my secret document in SharePoint Embedded?
So
no, that's just a joke. Sorry, yeah. Anyway, this is great, and everybody out there, don't hesitate to post your deep stuff here. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over back to you and go back on mute.
Very good. Thanks, sir. All right. So let's start to talk through some of the principles about containers. Again, containers are the heart and soul of SharePoint Embedded. This is where our documents go, and this is where you as a developer are going to interact with those documents in your applications. So let's take a deeper dive into exactly what the containers are and some of the things that we need to consider. Dedicated storage SharePoint partition in your application. So just like Reed and I talked about, this is that isolated area that you have permissions on, and you also have the ability to transact on that content individually. So that's where it's not part of your traditional storage quota within a SharePoint environment. We'll get into kind of what that pricing and so forth looks like here in a bit, but know that that is very much a separate activity that you have control over. Security boundary, I'm going to reiterate that over and over because that's the important part that we want to focus on. Permissions and security that are separate from your traditional SharePoint environment, but it still feeds off of Entra ID. Need to have those users in Entra so that they can interact with the documents, secure them as you need to based on your business application, but also manage that with the conditions or the configuration that you have in Entra, meaning if you have MFA enabled, fully supported, conditional access, information barriers, those, again, you're part of the M365 ecosystem, and that is something that's going to be supported as well. So let's take a look at the anatomy of a container. Containers are delineated into really two types. The trial container, what you think it is, valid for 30 days. They do bomb out, if you will, or time bomb, meaning that they cannot be extended. There's not a mechanism to convert those from a trial to a paid container or a standard container. So as you're looking through or testing that within your application, do be very aware that 30 days is 30 days. Then we move into standard containers. These are more of our production oriented. This is what we're going to use to deploy out into the application when we go to a live environment. It does require an Azure subscription, and that Azure subscription, when you create that container, will be associated with that transactions, the number of documents that you put in, the API calls, and so forth, so that we can keep track of that on a billing perspective. And we'll talk about that here in a bit more detail. From there, we need to create what's called a container type ID. So this is nothing more than telling SharePoint, hey, I've got a new application that I'm deploying. I need to create or tell you about this. And when you register that container within SharePoint, then you're going to see that in the SharePoint Admin Center. On the left-hand side, you're going to see a new containers vertical, and it will have the active containers and the deleted containers that you have visibility to. But this is where you are now setting up the framework within SharePoint to say, hey, I'm going to create some containers for this application. Think of the container type ID as nothing more than a manifest or a configuration that tells SharePoint about that. Currently, when you do register that, that is a SharePoint Online REST call. We are working on a Graph API call soon, but do want to point that out as an important distinction there. All right, registering that container type, again, that ability to tell SharePoint, here I am. This is going to be assigned permissions so that you can add those permissions to that container. And then you have the plumbing in order to create those containers. And that's where we're going to focus the rest of the discussion is, how do we create those containers? How do we use those containers? How do we share documents and things like that? We do need to talk about, of course, the plumbing, getting it set up within SharePoint. Once we have that, again, those are where the core features of that container is. That's where our files and folders are going to be. That's where the metadata is going to be on that container itself. We'll talk about permissions again, and we'll talk about scalability. We are noticing that from a transactional perspective, this is performing quite a bit faster than the traditional API calls that you would experience in a SharePoint environment. So know that we are scaling this to be a faster environment. All right, let's take a little deeper dive on permissions. So when we talk about permissions, again, this is all based on the Entra ID and the configuration that you have within your Entra and Azure environment. When you first establish that enterprise application, and I've got a slide here in a second that goes through that creation process, you'll create that enterprise application in Azure. When you create that, the graph permissions that are going to be required are that file storage container.selected. This allows people and developers to create those new containers and use that within your applications. From a search perspective, you do need to have the files.read.all permission granted for that container as well. Oops. Again, back to the additive permissions. When you're creating that container and you're assigning the permissions to that container, as you're adding files and folders in that condition that will inherit it from the parent object. So imagine that you've got a folder that Read has access to. I create another folder. I don't modify any of the permissions that are on that folder. It's going to inherit those permissions just like you would suspect from that parent object. This is where you have the ability to add permissions to that folder. Okay, so again, back to that additive nature. I'm going to add someone to that folder. I'm going to give them a different permission level. Maybe they're going to go from edit to ownership or view to read to edit. Those types of things are supported in the API. Again, from an item level permission, currently that isn't something that we support. We are looking at adding that on the roadmap here in the short term. And these are the roles that you have the ability to configure in that container. So traditional CRUD operations, the create, write, update, and delete on the documents that you have in your containers, but also who has the ability to manage the memberships, who has ownership of that document. All of those, again, configurable through the API as you're creating those files, folders within that particular container. And then lastly, sharing. We're going to talk sharing here in pretty deep order here in a second, but how do I create a link to the document? How do I share that document so that people can collaborate on that? We'll take a little deeper dive on that here in just a second, but know that as from a permission perspective, those are also some capabilities that you do have at the container level. Okay. All right, so let's focus a little bit more on the creation process that happens. And this is pretty well documented so that you can follow through and create that enterprise application or that application registration in Azure. So that's kind of the first order of business that an administrator will most likely do. And this is where we start to separate out the administrator role from the developer role. Naturally, we're going to have for larger organizations, you may see billing administrators. You may have to go through security compliance, sign off, governance, things like that. So not too uncommon there. But from an application perspective, that enterprise or that app registration does need to be registered within Azure. Once that's registered within Azure, that's where you can now use that PowerShell command to tell SharePoint about it. We need to register that container type with SharePoint. This gives us the ability to get that bearer token. And this is going to be critical in your application so that now when you're starting to use those graph endpoints, you need to authenticate into the Azure environment to make those calls. That bearer token is going to be your key. And there's application and delegated permissions that are available there. Once you have that set up, let's start using it. Create the containers that you want to use within your application. We'll get into some container type strategy here in just a second. But as you're creating those containers, again, that's where your documents live. How are you going to support that? How are you going to interact with those? How are you going to secure them within the application? There's a little bit of art and science there that we'll walk through. But once you have that set up in your Azure environment, that is what you're going to focus on from there. Again, everything is driven by the Graph API. I want to reemphasize that all those org policies that you have in place, MFA, conditional access, information barriers, geo boundary are supported there as well. But then from the application side, this is your application. What do you want it to do? How do you want to handle that user experience? You've got that all within the coding aspect of that pro developer environment that you're in now. From a compliance perspective, manage that security, manage those governance policies that you have in place. I know for a lot of highly regulated organizations, they have to have sensitivity labels, they have to have retention policies. We need to make those available in e-discovery so that we can create cases, we can put those on litigation hold, all of the traditional things that you would expect in a governance organization, fully supported there. So let's talk about sharing. A couple ways that we can share a document. Traditional way of going into the document within the Office experience, hitting that share button and sharing it with whoever you want to as well. You now have the ability to do that within the application as well. There's a graph endpoint where you configure which item you want to share, provide what that sharing right is, and then the people that are designated to view the document or that you shared it with now have access to it. Okay. Also, the ability to create a link to the document. So now you want to create a link that's distributable and people can share that with the folks that have access to it. Create that shareable link, determine what kind of permissions you want to put on that link, and then you can distribute that out. So now imagine that you've got the use case of I need to collect my tax documents from XYZ. Now, if I create that shareable link, I send it to that person. They have the ability to drop their documents in there. I've scoped it to that person so that Reed doesn't get crazy and put all kinds of other documents into my SharePoint container. This is where you have some of that parameters that you can put around that links that you're creating. Okay, and I do have some guidance on which one is going to be best for the appropriate scenario that you're dealing with. Okay, so if you've got a use case where you need to generate a shareable link for that document or file, great. Or if you want to directly share this document with a specific set of users, then you have the ability to do that. So you'll get a full copy of the deck with all of this in here, but I wanted to make sure that we have some references here for you to focus on. Okay. One more slide here, Reed, and then I want to take a strategic pause to see if we have any comments. But let's first talk about some of the container architecture that we're starting to see. And I lumped this into three broad categories, if you will. We have some of the enterprise applications. So this is your organization creating an application to support business process that is within the company. Think of projects. Think of my claims example again. So from a project perspective, you're creating a new project. You want to have that security boundary around the project documents. Probably a good scenario to create a different container for each of the projects that you have, put those project documents in there, and now when you do a search across all of those project documents, you're only going to get results on the containers that you have access to. So security trimming, as you would suspect in SharePoint, fully supported in SharePoint Embedded as well. Again, from a claims perspective, maybe a little different angle. You want to be able to have all the claims in one container so that it's a little bit easier to manage. Separate out those batch of claims that come in by day or vendor, whatever makes sense to you, but you're only managing claims in the one container. So a couple things to think about there from a scalability perspective. Then we start to introduce some external collaboration. So again, the use cases, we've got documents that we're gathering from our customers, our vendors, and they need to drop them into the containers. Again, this may be a good example of multiple containers based on the security boundary. So if you have clients that you're gathering documents from, probably a good idea, create a container for each client, put the documents in that container. They only see their documents because that's how you permission that container. And you sleep good at night because now if somebody comes in and adds permission to a container that contains all of the tax documents, yeah, that may not be a good night's sleep. So different strategies there where you can focus on how you configure those. Always permissions and security in mind there. Okay? And then lastly, from an ISV perspective, you're an ISV, you're creating a cool application that you want to distribute out to your customers. Naturally, you don't want to keep those documents in your tenant. They want the documents in their tenant around their security boundary, their organizational policies, but you want to be able to manage the billing, if you will, so the pass-through billing or the application deployment process. That's where you can now deploy the application into their tenant, take control of that billing. So if you want to bill them on a monthly basis, but there's some services that you may include in there, manage fees, things like that, now you've got the ability to do that from an ISV perspective. So kind of that one-to-many approach from a container distribution perspective. Okay. So Reed, I'm going to pause there strategically to see if we do have any questions that we can focus on here.
All right, this is great. And so we still have a shy group here in the doldrums of August. But I wonder if you would mind going back a little bit and talking a little bit more about container types, since that's such a foundational issue for people. And I've got two questions for you. So the first one is I want to talk about trial versus standard. Um, which one of those should you use if you're just kicking the tires? And which one of those should you use when you start to develop an app?
Good question. When you're kicking the tires, you're just trying to figure out, geez, what is a container and is this something that's going to meet my use case? If you do have dedicated time within that 30-day period, kick up a trial. There is a Visual Studio Code plugin that we have that you simply put in your credentials and it will create all of the plumbing, if you will, in Azure and in SharePoint to create that trial container. You're up and running in a few seconds. Okay? So good things to just kind of get a feel for what it can do for you. If you're going down the standard route, or if you're an organization where 30 days may not be enough, then standard containers are going to be the way to go. Again, from an Azure subscription standpoint, work with the billing folks, make sure that everything is good to go there. But that is going to be from a production ready perspective where you're going to want to focus that container type to.
Cool. And we have lots of documentation over in Microsoft Learn about how to create both of these, and it's very straightforward. But let me ask you this. How often does a typical developer or user or administrator, how often do they actually create a container type?
Not very often, because when you're focusing on that application, you need to create the container type so that you can get that going on your application standpoint. Traditionally, it's a one and done deal. After that, you're in the container management business. You're not in the container type. You've told SharePoint, hey, here's my application. Here's the permissions that I want to use on it. Now, hand that off to the developers, let them create the containers to support the application and so forth. So it's not a heavy administrative burden or activity that needs to happen. Take that, hand it off, let the developers do what they do best.
Right. And so an end user of an application, they never have to worry about a container type.
They got no idea what a container type is.
Okay.
They know what the application is. They are going
Right.
to use the experience of your application. They know documents get stored somewhere, and that's great. They know that when they click on a link, they're going to be brought into that Office experience that they know and they love. And that's great. That's the simplicity of SharePoint Embedded from a user perspective, but also the flexibility and the scalability that the developers want. So it's really kind of a win-win for the entire organization or the customer base there.
Right. Okay, so container types to summarize, if you're just kicking the tires as a developer, trial's the way to go. It's free and easy. As soon as you start doing an actual development project, you should be using a standard one so that it lasts beyond 30 days and you can just keep doing your work. And then really from a container type, you really only create those at the beginning of a project. It's not something that you have to worry about on an ongoing basis.
Correct. Yep.
Got it.
Excellent.
Okay,
Excellent.
cool. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, just a reminder to our listeners out there, although I have great questions, I know for a fact you have better ones. So jump in, don't hesitate. And Steve, I'm going to turn it over back to you.
Very good. All right. And we are going to continue down the path of metadata. All right. So if you're familiar with the metadata concept in SharePoint, very similar to a SharePoint embedded environment. Couple nuances that I will point out. Metadata is attached at the container level. So you'll notice I've got a couple different containers here. I may have the same metadata that spans across multiple containers, but as I'm creating that container, that's where I'm going to assign that metadata at the container level. And when you're adding the document into the container, then you assign the metadata accordingly. Once you assign the metadata accordingly, then it supports most common field types. So think of text field, multi-text, choice, things like that. Yes, no. All configured through the graph. So when you add that document into the container, if there's metadata that is to be added, that'll be in the body of the payload that goes into that call. These are managed properties that you can search on. So if you wanted to say, hey, give me all of the customer number XYZ in a specific container, those search results is going to be what you're going to see. So from a metadata perspective, manage that in a similar fashion that you are used to in the SharePoint world. know that you can use the KQL or the search query language to get the results that you want from that particular document as well. So content types are not supported. So I want to be pretty clear on this one. The metadata that you assign to that container, because remember, in a container, you've got files and folders. Okay. As you're adding the metadata to the container, assign metadata to those files and folders. This is where a content type construct isn't supported in the SharePoint container, or some of the normal taxonomies that you might be used to. So think of the term store, think of those hierarchy and so forth. Those are things that are more complex field types that aren't there. And also stick to standard SharePoint naming conventions. Don't start out with a number, an underscore, try and camel case your metadata together. Easier when you do those API calls if you're not worrying about dangling spaces here and there. So typical naming conventions if you're used to. Good practice there as well. Okay. All right, so from a billing perspective, transitioning a little bit into what that looks like. Again, when you configure that Azure subscription with that container, that's where, as you're transacting documents going into the containers, you're making the API calls, you're downloading documents, that's where you're going to start to see those charges start to accumulate. From a standard, I call this a standard tenant or configuration, if you will, you're creating your application, folks are adding documents in there, and you as a customer, you as an organization are paying for them. And you'll be able to see that in your Azure billing profile, just like you would any other service that you subscribe to that uses a subscription. If you're in an ISV scenario, this is where things get a little different. Configure that in the tenant, deploy that to the customer tenant, but now you have the ability to isolate that per customer. So now you can determine, hey, which is the customer that I need to bill? Again, if you're wanting to put some, service fees or management fees on top of that as you're billing that, you can do that as well. So that pass-through billing that you're configuring in Azure will help you support that as well. Okay, again, fully visible within the Azure billing portal as you normally would suspect. All right, a couple last slides here. I will throw out some of the pricing here. Some things to consider with the pricing. Thoroughly a pay-as-you-go model. Only consume what you are putting into those containers. So from a storage perspective, if you're putting in a gig a day, great. That's what the price is going to be. And that will be billed accordingly. Again, for those graph API transactions, if you have a transactional system, I look at the claims use case as a prime example, you're going to have some higher transactions there. You can start to plan on what those API calls are going to be. And that egress, right? So this is the one that gets a little fuzzy. So think of the egress is if you're taking that document out of that SharePoint embedded container. So you're downloading that to take somewhere else and get it out of the system, if you will. There's going to be an egress charge there. But what's not charged is if you're opening the document in the Office experience, or if you're opening that in the client experience, all of those are not considered an egress charge. So, bits and nuances there. So plan accordingly, depending on what the functionality of your application is and how many transactions you're expected to consider there. All right, so a bit of a roadmap overview here, something to look forward to. From today, a lot of features, activities, functionality that you have in the application today. Some things that are coming within the next 60 days. Yeah, Copilot, top of the list here. So there is going to be Copilot integration into SharePoint Embedded. We're working through some of the private preview customers right now. Expect more announcements on that here shortly. Copy and move across containers. Very, very good stuff there. So now you can copy and move content as you need to. The clone container. So think of the project scenario again. You've got a container that you set up that are configured with your folders a certain way because that's how you manage projects. create that template container, if you will, use the clone mechanism to create a new project straight away, and you're good to go. So some things to think about there from a cloning perspective. Moving it across geos, if you're a multi-geo organization, have the ability to move those containers across. Recycle bin retention. So this is an interesting one. I know that a lot of regulatory industries, 93 days is a bit long for the governance that most people are comfortable with. Have the ability to set that for a certain retention period that you're comfortable with, and it will honor that as well. Okay. Again, you see that restrictive item level permission. So we talked a lot about additive permissions in a container. Know that that item level granularity is, again, on their roadmap. And then some things we're looking at in the future, group-owned containers versus individual-owned containers. Graph API for that container type management. Again, moving from the SharePoint REST call to the Graph API, something we're looking for as well. Bulk permission management. Yeah, let's manage those things in a massive or a more scalable way. And then removing the files.read.all requirement. We've heard a lot of feedback on the ability to get a little bit more granular there, and we were certainly hearing what you have to say there. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about a little bit on the Customer Connection Program. So this is a pretty cool program that we have that allows you to work with engineering and get guidance as you're deploying that application into a production environment. So there's a lot of great one-on-one and group types of environments where you can start to learn from us, get guidance from us, and successfully deploy that out to your production environment. I'll leave this up here for a minute so you can see what some of the qualifications are, but this is really just a fantastic way of getting that support that you need to make sure that that application is going to deploy to scale within the organization. Okay. All right, and with that, I am going to come to a close here. Oh, I want to make sure that we don't forget about the event that's happening in both London and New York. You'll see the dates there. You'll see the registration link at the bottom. Please make sure you register. There's going to be a lot of us there to listen to your feedback, walk you through how to get started with SharePoint Embedded, hands-on keyboard, get some feedback, talk with other folks that are there, see what they're doing with it. Just a great event for you to learn and implement SharePoint Embedded within your organization. Some fantastic resources that you have. We do, like Reed said, full documentation that we're constantly updating there. Lots of other videos. This is just one of a series of videos that we've created to get you introduced into SharePoint Embedded. How are you going to be successful with it from a developer perspective, a setup perspective, a billing perspective, all those things that you need to know to get that implemented. We are there for you. And then also, naturally, what are the API references that you can use within your applications to get going. Even on GitHub, we have some sample applications that we're working on so that you can start to see how to incorporate that into things that you're working on. And with that, I will kind of pause there. Reed, I'll kind of see if there are any questions that have surfaced in the chat here before we call it.
Yeah, we do have some great questions. So thanks everybody for jumping in here. I'm going to start off with just a question to close out some stuff about container type IDs. We had a good question that is about how container type IDs are scoped. Are they unique in the tenant, or are they unique across the global Microsoft service?
Yeah, good question. They are absolutely unique in the tenant. Because they're a GUID, naturally, that's going to be that globally unique identifier. Just curious if the use case is more on a multi-tenant or multi-geo environment, which I'm suspecting it is.
Yeah, I suspect, and I actually don't know the answer to this one, whether the scenario is about, the multi-geo, et cetera. But, one of the reasons that we have them as a globally unique ID is that the ISV app needs to be able to be installed in any tenant. And so an ISV app will have that container type ID, and that container type ID will be globally the same for every customer that installs it, right? So I think that's a really important point for us to make. We had a second question here. Anything else on that before we move on?
No, please. The only thought that I had there is when we're creating a globally unique identifier per site collection, so think of a doc ID as being a GUID, right?
Sure.
We'll always support that within the site collection to be unique, but when it reaches outside of that, it's not fully supported. But in my 20-some years of working with SharePoint, I've never seen a GUID that has been outside of a site collection that's repeated. So that unique identifier holds true.
And this is outside of a site collection, so it's definitely designed to be unique there. Let's talk real quick about M365 experiences. The actual question is this all the same index? When a document comes in, is it indexed the same way? Is the index logically isolated or physically isolated in some way? How does that typically work, and how does that impact the search experience?
Yep, great question. When a document is added through SharePoint Embedded, it is added to the SharePoint index, but there is a attribute, if you will, that separates that from the full SharePoint search experience. So if I go into that SharePoint search experience on the header bar like I normally do, and I search for read secret document that's in a container, because it is scoped to that container, it's not going to appear in that SharePoint search results. When you're doing a search within SharePoint Embedded, there is a attribute in the call that you need to specify that says, hey, I'm searching a SharePoint container. And that is how it will identify the contents in that container or the container type, the application, and scope it to those results that are coming back, so that you're not mixing in any of the SharePoint search index that you have there. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to recreate the SharePoint search index. That's a lot of complicated work there. So we're taking advantage of that, but we're isolating that per container for security and scalability.
Yeah. And so the default is that when you configure a container type, the default is whatever information you have in there is not discoverable, but you can configure the container type so that it does participate in M365 discoverability experiences, like search. And so that's the key thing in there that's really interesting. But let's talk about Copilot for a second, because Copilot is such an interesting topic now. And of course that ties to the semantic index. Does that use the same type of discovery disabled, or its name is a different flag, but does it use that same kind of thing there?
It does, yeah. Because when things go into the semantic index, first thing you always need to consider is security. You're only going to see what you have access to in that semantic index. But from a Copilot perspective, it is very much aware of, I'm using the SharePoint Embedded Copilot experience, and I'm going to scope that to my containers versus the M365 Copilot experience that searches all of that content respectively. So very much aware of the security boundaries that the copilots with a little c have access to and return or reason over within that experience. I'll also note too that the metadata that is used within a container, that is not used in a Copilot experience. So only the content of the document and the title and author, things like that, are used in that reasoning experience within Copilot.
Got it. It's interesting as we go more and more down the Copilot route with SharePoint Embedded. The first time I ever saw regular Microsoft 365 capital C Copilot reason over content in a SharePoint Embedded container, again, where it had permissions, right? It had the right permission set up for that. Where the first time I saw that was kind of mind-blowing, because now a customer can build whatever line of business app they would need to work with files and documents. And if they configure it, they can work with regular Microsoft 365 capital C Copilot just out of the box. I mean, it's pretty exciting. So
It is pretty amazing. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yep. And I always go back to the permissions, like you mentioned, Regis, to say,
Mhm.
hey, if I've got this container wide open for everybody, guess what? It's going to be used in that Copilot reasoning experience. That's why I wanted to spend quite a bit of time on what are the different permission configurations as you have a container versus a regular SharePoint experience so that you are designing that to be secure from the start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple more quick topics. And
Yeah.
I think this actually extends on the security conversation here. We had a question about, do we need to do anything specific to enable SharePoint embedded in a tenant now that we're GA? And the answer to that is no. In private preview, we did, right?
Yeah.
But you talked a little bit around registering a container type and what it takes to actually get SharePoint embedded working. Can you cover a little bit more about that? Because like there's some detail there. Like we don't have to enable SPE, but there is stuff that we have to do to make sure it works.
Yep. There's nothing on the tenant level that you need to enable. Again, like Reed said, when we went GA, the requirement to enable SharePoint embedded in the tenant admin went away. What you do need to be aware of is as you're creating that application registration in Azure, that's where you're assigning those permissions to that app registration. Once you have that app registration created, that's where you need to use that SharePoint PowerShell command to tell SharePoint, hey, I created this container type. I want to register it with SharePoint so that now I can create containers to use within my application. So that's really the key thing there is creating the plumbing in Azure so that we can bill against it and we can secure it accordingly to the Graph API. Now we need to tell SharePoint, I'm here, register that with the SharePoint Admin Center so that developers can start to create those containers.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions on the thread. Thanks everybody who jumped in here. And believe it or not, I don't have any more questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Steve.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I do appreciate your time today. If you do have any additional questions on SharePoint Embedded, please reach out to us. More than happy to respond to that. Keep the thread active and also look for us on LinkedIn. More than happy to connect with you, learn more about your use cases, how you're wanting to use SharePoint Embedded, the feedback as you're starting to implement that within your applications, critical to the continued success that we're going to have with the product. So with that, if there are no more questions, I do want to thank you for your time. And again, don't be strangers.